The moment I saw Brenda Whitmore standing at my property line with her clipboard and that pursed lip expression of disapproval, I knew my peaceful Saturday morning was about to get complicated. I had just fired up my new Firewood processor for the first time, watching with satisfaction as it efficiently split and stacked logs that would have taken me hours to do by hand. The machine hummed steadily on the far corner of my 5-acre property in rural Pennsylvania, just outside of Millbrook Township. I had specifically placed it there, near my small equipment barn, away from the nearest neighbor's house by at least 300 yards. "Excuse me, Patrick Yardley," Brenda called out, her voice carrying that particular tone that said she was about to make my life difficult. She was in her late 40s, with precisely styled blonde hair that probably required more product than I used in a year, and she wore a cream-colored pantsuit despite it being a Saturday morning. "I need to speak with you about that monstrosity you have running over there." I shut off the processor and walked over to where she stood, noting that she had carefully positioned herself exactly at what she believed was my property line. In reality, she was about 2 feet onto my land, but I decided not to mention that yet. "Good morning, Brenda. What can I help you with?" She clicked her pen and made a mark on her clipboard. "That industrial equipment you have operating is in direct violation of Section 7, Paragraph 12 of the Meadowbrook Estates HOA bylaws. No industrial equipment or machinery shall be visible from any public road or adjacent property." I wiped my hands on my jeans and took a deep breath. When I had purchased this property 2 years ago, I had specifically looked for a place outside of HOA jurisdiction. The house and 3 acres closest to the road were technically part of the old Meadowbrook Estates development from the 1980s, but the previous owner had acquired the back 2 acres from an adjacent farm. That made things complicated, but I had been assured during closing that the HOA's authority was limited. "Brenda, that's a Firewood processor. It's farm equipment, and it's on the back portion of my property, which isn't subject to HOA oversight." Her eyes narrowed. "All property within the boundaries of 2847 Meadowbrook Lane falls under our jurisdiction, and that is clearly industrial equipment. I'm giving you until next Friday to remove it, or we'll be forced to take legal action." "It's licensed as farm equipment," I repeated, keeping my voice level. "I have the registration and everything. It's the same classification as a tractor or a combine." "I don't care if it's licensed as a spaceship," Brenda snapped. "It's unsightly, it's noisy, and it doesn't belong in a residential neighborhood. 7 days, Mr. Yardley." She turned on her heel and marched back toward her white Lexus SUV parked on the road. I watched her go, feeling my morning mood souring rapidly. I had specifically bought this property because I wanted space to do projects like this. I heated my house entirely with wood during the Pennsylvania winters, and the processor would save me countless hours of back-breaking work. More importantly, I was right. The Firewood processor was legally classified as agricultural equipment. I had done my research before purchasing it. The model I bought, a 20-ton hydraulic unit mounted on a trailer, was specifically designed for small farms and homesteads. It even came with a farm equipment license plate. I pulled out my phone and called my real estate lawyer, Marcus Henderson. He had handled my property purchase and had warned me that the HOA situation might become problematic down the line. "Patrick, good to hear from you," Marcus answered on the 3rd ring. "What's the problem?" I explained the situation, including Brenda's threat about legal action. Marcus listened quietly, then sighed. "Okay, here's the deal. Your property is split-zoned. The front 3 acres are residential and fall under the HOA covenant that was recorded in 1983. The back 2 acres were rezoned as agricultural in 1998 when Old Man Patterson bought them and added them to his farm. When the current parcel was created by combining those 2 sections, nobody bothered to resolve the HOA question. So, what does that mean for me? It means if your equipment is on the agricultural portion, the HOA has no jurisdiction, but you'll need to prove exactly where the zoning line falls. Do you have a survey? I have the one from when I bought the place. Get it out and check it. If you're clean, send the HOA a certified letter explaining the situation. Include copies of your survey, the agricultural zoning designation, and the farm equipment registration. That should shut them down. I thanked Marcus and hung up, then spent the next hour digging through my files in the house. I found the survey and spread it out on my kitchen table. Sure enough, the zoning line ran roughly along a natural ridge about 150 feet from my house. My equipment barn and the firewood processor were clearly on the agricultural side. I felt a sense of satisfaction as I gathered the documents. This should be straightforward. I scanned everything, created a detailed letter explaining the legal situation, and sent it off to both Brenda personally and the HOA board generally via certified mail. I also emailed copies to create a paper trail. That should have been the end of it. Monday evening, I came home from my job as a civil engineer to find a bright orange sticker on my equipment barn door. It declared that the structure and all equipment within 100 feet were in violation of community standards, and that I had been fined $500 with an additional $500 per day until the violation was corrected. I called Marcus immediately. "They can't do that," he said flatly. "Not on the agricultural portion. Don't pay the fine. I'll draft a response." Tuesday morning, I found my driveway blocked by Brenda's Lexus when I tried to leave for work. She was standing beside it, arms crossed, with 2 other HOA board members flanking her like bodyguards. I recognized Bill Patterson, a retired accountant, and Sharon Fernsby, who ran a local boutique. I rolled down my window. "You're blocking my driveway. We need to discuss your continued refusal to comply with community standards," Brenda said. "I sent you a certified letter explaining the legal situation. The equipment is on agricultural land outside your jurisdiction." Bill stepped forward, adjusting his glasses. "We've consulted with our attorney. The original HOA covenant covers the entire property as it was platted in 1983. Any subsequent zoning changes don't override the covenant." I felt my temper rising but kept it in check. That's not how property law works. Agricultural zoning supersedes HOA covenants for agricultural use. Our lawyer says differently, Sharon chimed in. "The covenant runs with the land." "Then your lawyer is wrong. Now please move your vehicle so I can get to work." Brenda didn't budge. "Not until you agree to remove that equipment." I put my truck in park and pulled out my phone. "Then I'm calling the police for an illegal roadway obstruction." That got them moving. Brenda shot me a venomous look but got in her SUV and backed up. As I drove past, I could see her on her phone, probably calling their lawyer or scheming up her next move. At work, I had trouble concentrating. I had never been the type to enjoy conflict, and this situation was escalating faster than I had anticipated. During my lunch break, I called Marcus again. "I'm going to file for a declaratory judgment," he said. "We'll get a court to formally rule on the jurisdiction question. It'll cost you a few $1,000s, but it'll settle this once and for all." "Do it," I said. "I'm not backing down on this." That evening, I decided to document everything. I took photos of the equipment processor's location, its farm equipment registration plate, and the survey markers that delineated the zoning boundary. I also set up a trail camera pointed at my driveway and another at the equipment barn. If the HOA decided to escalate further, I wanted evidence. Wednesday brought a new surprise. I received a certified letter from the Meadowbrook Estates HOA attorney, a firm called Davidson and Shore out of Pittsburgh. The letter demanded immediate removal of the industrial equipment and payment of $1,500 in accumulated fines. It threatened to place a lien on my property if I didn't comply within 10 days. Marcus reviewed the letter and laughed. These guys are idiots. They're going to get themselves in serious trouble. You can't lien property for HOA violations that aren't actually violations. That's abuse of the lien process. So what do? We file our declaratory judgment action, and we include a claim for harassment and abuse of process. If we win, they'll have to pay your legal fees. The paperwork was filed by Friday. That weekend, I decided to run my Firewood processor despite the HOA's objections. I had 3 cords of logs that needed processing, and I wasn't going to let Brenda and her clipboard dictate how I managed my property. I was about 2 hours into the work when a Pennsylvania State Police cruiser pulled up my driveway. I shut down the processor and walked over, concerned but not panicked. I hadn't done anything wrong. The trooper who stepped out was in his mid-30s, with the professional demeanor of someone who had seen too much nonsense. His nameplate read, Trooper Mitchell. Afternoon, sir. Are you Patrick Yardley? I am. What can I help you with, Trooper? I received a complaint about industrial equipment operating in a residential zone. Mind if I take a look? I relaxed slightly. Not at all, follow me. I led him to the processor and explained the entire situation, including the split zoning, the agricultural classification of the equipment, and the HOA dispute. Trooper Mitchell listened carefully, then walked around the property, checking the survey markers I pointed out. Do you have documentation for all this? I do. Give me a minute. I jogged back to the house and returned with copies of everything: the survey, the zoning maps, the farm equipment registration, and Marcus's letters to the HOA. Trooper Mitchell reviewed them thoroughly, taking his time. Finally, he looked up. Mr. Yardley, this equipment is properly registered as farm equipment, and according to this survey, it's located on agriculturally zoned land. You're not in violation of anything. I tried to explain that to the HOA. He handed the documents back to me. I'm going to note in my report that this is a civil dispute between you and your HOA, not a criminal or zoning matter. If they call again, I'll refer them to the civil courts. You might also want to file a complaint with the township about harassment. I appreciate that, Trooper. After he left, I felt vindicated but also exhausted. This was only going to get worse before it got better. I decided to call my parents, who lived in Ohio, just to vent. Honey, you need to stand your ground, my mother said. These HOA types are bullies. They push until someone pushes back. My father, ever practical, added, make sure you document everything, and don't lose your temper. That's what they want. Monday morning brought yet another development. When I checked my email, I found a message from Brenda to the entire Meadowbrook Estates community email list. The subject line read, Dangerous industrial activity in our neighborhood. The email was a masterpiece of misleading language. It described my Firewood processor as heavy industrial equipment creating noise pollution and safety hazards, and claimed I was operating a commercial lumber processing facility on residential property. It urged all residents to contact the township zoning office and demand action. I forwarded it to Marcus with a note. Is this defamation? His response came within an hour. Borderline. Save it. If she keeps it up, we can add it to our case. That afternoon, I received calls from 3 neighbors asking about the situation. 2 of them were supportive once I explained the actual facts. The third, an older man named Harold who lived 4 houses down, seemed convinced I was running some kind of illegal operation. "I don't care what kind of license it has," Harold grumbled. "It's too loud and it doesn't belong here." "Harold, it's 300 yards from the nearest house, and I only run it during daylight hours on weekends. It's no louder than a lawn mower." "Well, Brenda says it's a safety hazard." "Brenda is wrong. And she's harassing me over equipment that's on agricultural land outside the HOA's jurisdiction." Harold hung up on me. I added his number to my call log, documenting the conversation. Wednesday brought the HOA's most aggressive move yet. I came home to find a professional surveying crew on my property, complete with equipment and stakes. A man in a reflective vest was walking the property line with a GPS unit. I parked and approached them. "Excuse me, who authorized you to be on my property?" The crew chief, a weathered man in his 50s, pulled out a work order. "We were hired by the Meadowbrook Estates HOA to verify property boundaries and zoning designations." "I didn't authorize that," he frowned. "The HOA said they had the right to survey common areas and disputed boundaries." "This isn't a common area or a disputed boundary. It's my private property. I'm going to have to ask you to leave." The crew chief looked uncomfortable. "Look, we were paid to do a job. We're just trying to complete the survey." I pulled out my phone. "Then you can complete it after you get a court order authorizing entry onto my property. Otherwise, you're trespassing." They packed up and left, but not before the crew chief told me they'd been paid $5,000 for a rush job. Someone was spending serious money on this dispute. Marcus was furious when I told him. "That's trespass. File a police report. I want documentation of their increasingly aggressive behavior." I drove to the state police barracks and filed a report with Trooper Mitchell, who remembered me from the previous weekend. He took my statement and said he'd follow up with the surveying company. "These HOA disputes get nasty sometimes," he said. "I've seen neighbors who were friends for 20 years end up in court over stuff like this. You're doing the right thing by documenting everything." Thursday evening, I got a call from an unlisted number. Against my better judgment, I answered. "Is this Patrick Yardley?" A woman's voice, professional but cold. "Who's calling?" "This is Natalie Armstrong from Action News 7 in Pittsburgh. I understand you're having a dispute with your HOA over industrial equipment. We'd like to do a story." I paused. Media attention could cut both ways. "How did you hear about this?" "We received a press release from the Meadowbrook Estates HOA. They're claiming you're operating dangerous equipment in a residential neighborhood." Of course, Brenda had gone to the media. "That's not accurate. I'm operating farm equipment on agricultural land. The HOA is harassing me because they don't understand property law." "Would you be willing to go on camera?" I thought about it. "Let me talk to my attorney and get back to you." Marcus's advice was clear. "Do the interview. Get your side out there first. Just stick to the facts and don't trash talk the HOA. Be the reasonable guy dealing with unreasonable people." I called Natalie back and agreed to an interview on Saturday morning. She said they'd also be interviewing Brenda and would air the story Monday evening. Friday afternoon, Marcus called with news. "The court has scheduled a hearing on our declaratory judgment action for 3 weeks from now. In the meantime, I filed for a temporary restraining order to stop the HOA from continuing their harassment. The judge is reviewing it." "What are our chances?" "Good. You've got the law on your side. The question is whether the judge will see this as important enough to issue a TRO. Some judges don't like to interfere in HOA disputes unless there's actual harm being done." Saturday morning arrived with clear skies and moderate temperatures. The news crew showed up at 9, consisting of Natalie, a cameraman, and a sound technician. Natalie was in her early 30s, professionally dressed, with the practiced composure of someone who did this every day. We started with a tour of the property. I showed her the survey markers, explained the zoning split, and demonstrated the Firewood processor. The equipment was actually quite impressive in operation, efficiently processing logs into neat stacks of split firewood. "So this is legal farm equipment?" Natalie asked, microphone in hand. "Absolutely. It's registered with the state as agricultural equipment, same as a tractor. I use it to process firewood for heating my home and for a small side business where I sell cords to neighbors. That qualifies as agricultural use under Pennsylvania law." And the HOA disagrees. The HOA is claiming jurisdiction over land that's zoned agricultural. They're wrong, and they're harassing me instead of accepting the legal reality. They say you're operating an industrial facility. I gestured at the processor. "Does this look like an industrial facility? It's one piece of equipment on a trailer which I use a few hours a month. It's quieter than most lawn maintenance equipment, and it's 300 yards from the nearest neighbor." We talked for about 30 minutes. I made sure to emphasize that I respected property rights and community standards, but that I also expected the HOA to follow the law. Natalie seemed receptive to my side of the story. After they left, I spent the rest of the day processing firewood. By evening, I had 2 full cords split and stacked. The physical work was satisfying, a nice contrast to the mental stress of the legal battle. Sunday was quiet. I half expected Brenda to show up with some new complaint, but she stayed away. I used the time to organize all my documentation, creating a timeline of events and a folder with copies of every relevant document. Monday evening, I settled in to watch the news. The HOA story was the third segment, after a piece on local politics and a feature about a high school basketball team. Natalie's report was balanced but clearly skeptical of the HOA's position. They showed footage of my firewood processor in operation, with me explaining its agricultural classification. Then they cut to Brenda, filmed in front of the Meadowbrook Estates community sign. "This equipment is industrial in nature and doesn't belong in a residential community," Brenda said, her voice tight. "We have rules for a reason, and Mr. Yardley thinks he's above those rules." Natalie's voiceover noted the agricultural zoning and the dispute over HOA jurisdiction. They also showed my farm equipment registration and interviewed a local agricultural law expert who confirmed that properly registered farm equipment on agricultural land was generally exempt from HOA restrictions. The segment ended with Natalie noting that the case was headed to court and that a judge would make the final determination. My phone started ringing almost immediately. The first call was from my neighbor Tom, who lived 2 properties down. "Dude, I just saw you on the news." Brenda must be losing her mind. She's certainly committed to her position. A bunch of us think she's gone way too far with this HOA stuff. She tried to find me last month because my grass was half an inch too long. Half an inch. There's been talk about voting out the board at the next election. That was interesting. When's the next election? Annual meeting is in 6 weeks. We need to get people organized. After Tom hung up, I had 3 more calls from neighbors expressing support. Apparently Brenda had made herself unpopular with her aggressive enforcement of petty rules. My case was becoming a rallying point for broader frustration with the HOA board. Tuesday morning brought good news. Marcus called to tell me the judge had granted a temporary restraining order. The HOA was prohibited from fining me, attempting to place liens on my property, or entering my property without permission pending the hearing on the declaratory judgment. The judge's order was pretty pointed, Marcus said. She basically said the HOA's position appears to be legally dubious, and their enforcement actions were premature and potentially harassing. That's fantastic. Don't celebrate yet. They can still argue their case at the hearing, but this stops the harassment in the meantime. That afternoon, I had the restraining order hand delivered to Brenda, the HOA board, and their attorney. I wanted to make absolutely sure they received it and understood its terms. Wednesday evening, I got home to find my mailbox vandalized. Someone had taken a baseball bat to it, leaving it bent and dented. The trail camera I had installed on my equipment barn had also been spray painted over. I called Trooper Mitchell and filed another report. He came out personally to look at the damage. No proof it was HOA related, he said. But the timing is suspicious. I'll increase patrols in your area. I installed a new camera, this time a better hidden model with cloud backup. If someone was escalating to property damage, I wanted evidence. Thursday brought a certified letter from Davidson and Shore, the HOA's law firm. They were formally objecting to the restraining order and demanding its immediate dissolution. The letter was full of legal jargon but boiled down to, "We think we're right, and the judge was wrong to stop us." Marcus filed a response dismissing their objections. They're just posturing. The TRO stays in place until the hearing. The following week was relatively quiet. I went to work, processed firewood on the weekend, and tried to ignore the periodic glares I got from Brenda when I saw her around the neighborhood. The story had made enough local news that people recognized me at the grocery store. Most were supportive. 10 days before the hearing, things took a bizarre turn. I received a visit from a township code enforcement officer named George Parsons. He was a round man in his late 50s with a clipboard and a weary expression. "Mr. Yardley, I've received multiple complaints about unlicensed agricultural activity on your property. Complaints from the HOA. I'm not at liberty to say, but I need to inspect your operation." I showed him around, explaining everything again. George took notes, measured distances, and reviewed my documentation. After about an hour, he straightened up and handed back my papers. "Mr. Yardley, you're in full compliance with township codes. Your agricultural use is permitted under the zoning, your equipment is properly registered, and you're not creating any public nuisance. I'll note that in my report." "The HOA is going to keep complaining," George sighed. "Probably, but there's nothing I can do about that. You're legal, and that's the end of it from a code enforcement standpoint." After he left, I felt both validated and frustrated. How many more hoops would I have to jump through before this was over? The answer came sooner than I expected. 2 days later, I received a call from Marcus with alarming news. "The HOA just filed a counterclaim against you. They're alleging that your firewood processing constitutes a commercial business operation in violation of the residential covenant, and they're seeking an injunction and damages." Damages? For what? They're claiming your equipment has reduced property values and created a nuisance that has caused emotional distress to board members. I couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity. Emotional distress. It's a nuisance claim. They're throwing everything at the wall to see what sticks. Don't worry, it's weak. But it means the hearing just got more complicated. Over the next week, Marcus and I prepared for the hearing. We organized exhibits, lined up an expert witness on agricultural zoning, and prepared my testimony. I took time off work to meet with Marcus multiple times. "The key is to stay calm and factual," Marcus coached. "Don't get emotional. Don't insult the HOA. Just stick to the facts. Your equipment is farm equipment. It's on agricultural land. The HOA has no jurisdiction. The hearing was scheduled for a Wednesday morning at the Center County Courthouse. I put on my best suit and met Marcus in the parking lot at 8:30. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, with wooden benches and fluorescent lighting. Brenda was there with Bill and Sharon, along with their attorney, a slick-looking guy in his 40s named Robert Davidson. About a dozen Meadowbrook Estates residents had shown up, split between those supporting me and those supporting the HOA. Judge Catherine Morrison entered at 9 sharp. She was in her early 60s, with gray hair and an expression that suggested she had no patience for nonsense. "I've reviewed the pleadings," she began. "This appears to be a straightforward question of jurisdiction and property rights. Mr. Davidson, you're arguing that the HOA covenant supersedes agricultural zoning. Explain." Davidson stood and launched into his argument. He claimed that the covenant recorded in 1983 ran with the entire property and that any subsequent zoning changes were irrelevant. He argued that allowing my Firewood processor set a dangerous precedent that would allow anyone to claim agricultural use and evade HOA rules. Judge Morrison listened, occasionally making notes. When Davidson finished, she turned to Marcus. "Mr. Henderson." Marcus stood and methodically laid out our case. He presented the survey showing the zoning split, the agricultural designation recorded in 1998, and the Pennsylvania statutes that clearly established agricultural use as taking precedence over HOA covenants on agriculturally zoned land. He noted that my equipment was properly registered, and that the HOA had no evidence of any actual harm or nuisance. The judge asked several pointed questions about whether I was actually engaged in farming or just avoiding HOA rules. Marcus called me to the stand. Under oath, I explained my entire operation. I heated my house with wood, which required processing about 8 cords per year. I also sold firewood to a few neighbors, generating maybe $2,000 annually in supplemental income. I presented receipts, tax returns, and logs showing my firewood sales. "This isn't a hobby," I testified. "It's a legitimate agricultural activity that supplements my income and provides a service to my neighbors." Davidson cross-examined me aggressively, trying to establish that I was primarily a civil engineer, not a farmer. I held my ground, pointing out that many people engaged in part-time agricultural activities while holding other jobs. The judge called a 15-minute recess, then returned with her ruling. "I've heard enough," Judge Morrison said. "The law on this issue is clear. Agricultural use of property zoned for agriculture takes precedence over HOA covenants, particularly when that agricultural use is legitimate and properly licensed. Mr. Yardley has demonstrated that his firewood processing operation meets all criteria for agricultural activity under Pennsylvania law." She looked directly at Brenda and the HOA board. "The HOA's covenant does not extend to the agriculturally zoned portion of Mr. Yardley's property. The HOA has no authority to regulate farm equipment properly operated on that land. The restraining order is made permanent, and I'm ordering the HOA to immediately remove all fines, liens, or penalties imposed on Mr. Yardley related to this matter." Then her expression hardened. "Furthermore, I'm sanctioning the HOA and their counsel for pursuing legally frivolous claims after the jurisdictional issue was clearly explained to them. The HOA will pay Mr. Yardley's reasonable attorney fees and costs." Davidson tried to object, but Judge Morrison cut him off. "Counsel, your client was informed of the correct legal position multiple times. They chose to ignore it and continue harassing Mr. Yardley with escalating tactics. That's not zealous advocacy. That's abuse of process. The sanction stands. She banged her gavel and the hearing was over. I shook Marcus's hand, feeling a weight lift off my shoulders. As we left the courtroom, Brenda tried to intercept me. "This isn't over," she hissed. "We'll appeal." "You're welcome to waste more of the HOA's money," I said calmly, "but the judge was right. You never had jurisdiction." Outside, several of my neighbors who had attended the hearing congratulated me. Tom was particularly enthusiastic. "That was awesome. Did you see Brenda's face when the judge sanctioned them?" Over the next few days, word spread through the neighborhood about the ruling. I received dozens of emails and calls from residents, most expressing relief that someone had finally stood up to the HOA board's overreach. The following Tuesday, I received a formal letter from the HOA board announcing Brenda's resignation as president. Bill and Sharon had also resigned. Apparently, the membership had held an emergency meeting and demanded accountability for the legal fees and sanctions. The new interim president, a reasonable guy named Frank who lived on the other side of the development, called me personally to apologize. "Patrick, the board's handling of this situation was completely inappropriate. We're conducting a full review of our enforcement policies. This shouldn't have happened." "I appreciate that, Frank. I never wanted to be at war with the HOA. I just wanted to use my property legally." "Understood." For what it's worth, several of us are looking at ways to amend the covenant to better account for split-zoned properties. We don't want this kind of confusion in the future. That conversation represented the beginning of a real thaw in relations. Over the following weeks, I continued processing firewood without incident. The new HOA board left me alone, and the neighborhood settled into a new normal. Marcus's final bill for legal services came to about $8,000. The HOA was ordered to pay it, plus an additional $3,000 in sanctions, which they did without further protest. It felt good to be vindicated. About 6 weeks after the hearing, things took an unexpected and serious turn. I was processing firewood on a Saturday afternoon when Trooper Mitchell pulled up my driveway again, but this time he wasn't alone. 2 other state police vehicles followed him. I shut down the processor and walked over concerned. "Trooper, what's going on?" Mitchell's expression was grave. "Mr. Yardley, I need to ask you some questions about property damage and vandalism that occurred in the neighborhood over the past 2 months. My stomach dropped. "You think I had something to do with it?" "No," he said quickly. "But we think someone involved in your HOA dispute might have." "Do you still have footage from your trail cameras?" I did. In fact, I had months of footage automatically backed up to the cloud. "What are you looking for?" "We've had a series of incidents. Your mailbox being vandalized was one. But there were 3 others. Slashed tires on a resident who spoke up for you at the hearing, graffiti on another supporter's garage, and someone dumping motor oil on a lawn. We got a tip that Brenda Whitmore might be involved." My eyes widened. "Seriously?" "We need to check all surveillance footage from properties in the area. Yours might have caught vehicles coming and going." I pulled up my camera footage on my phone and showed Mitchell. We scrolled through several weeks of recordings. Most of it was boring footage of my driveway and equipment barn. But then Mitchell froze. "Stop, back up. There." The timestamp showed 3 in the morning, 2 days after the hearing. A white Lexus SUV was visible at the edge of the frame, parked on the road near my property. The license plate was partially visible. Mitchell called over one of the other troopers. They compared the plate to their records. "That's Brenda Whitmore's vehicle," the trooper confirmed. We kept searching and found 2 more instances of the same SUV appearing at odd hours. once near the time when graffiti appeared on a neighbor's garage, and once around the time another neighbor's tires were slashed. "Mr. Yardley, I need to take copies of this footage. It's potential evidence in a criminal investigation." "Of course. I'll email you the files right now." Mitchell looked troubled. "I never like to see these disputes turn criminal, but vandalism and property destruction cross a line." Over the next few days, I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that state police had executed a search warrant on Brenda's home. They had found spray paint matching the paint used in the graffiti, along with a journal where Brenda had documented her surveillance of HOA rule violators and those she considered enemies. A week later, Brenda was arrested and charged with multiple counts of criminal mischief and vandalism. The charges were serious enough that she was looking at potential jail time if convicted. The news sent shockwaves through Meadowbrook Estates. People who had supported Brenda's aggressive HOA enforcement were horrified to learn she had crossed into criminal activity. Others who had been her victims felt vindicated, but also troubled that things had gotten so out of hand. I felt no satisfaction in her arrest, only a kind of weary sadness. This whole situation had spiraled so far beyond what it should have been. If Brenda had just accepted the legal reality from the beginning, none of this would have happened. The criminal case moved through the system over the following months. Marcus kept me updated, as I was a potential witness due to my vandalized mailbox. Brenda initially tried to fight the charges, but the evidence against her was overwhelming. Security footage, the matching spray paint, her own journal entries, it all pointed to her guilt. In March, about 5 months after her arrest, Brenda accepted a plea deal. She pleaded guilty to 5 counts of criminal mischief and was sentenced to 2 years probation, 300 hours of community service, and ordered to pay restitution to all victims. She was also permanently barred from serving on any HOA board. The whole ordeal cost her far more than money. Her husband filed for divorce, citing the stress and embarrassment of her actions. She lost her job as a pharmaceutical sales representative after her employer learned of the conviction. Last I heard, she had moved out of state to stay with family. I felt a strange mix of emotions about her downfall. On one hand, she had brought it on herself through increasingly unhinged behavior. On the other hand, it seemed tragic that someone's need for control and inability to accept being wrong had destroyed her life. The new HOA board, led by Frank, took a completely different approach to community governance. They focused on genuinely important issues like maintaining common areas and organizing neighborhood events, while backing off from petty enforcement of minor rule violations. They also worked with a lawyer to amend the covenant to clearly acknowledge split-zoned properties and agricultural exemptions. My firewood processing business actually grew. Word spread about my operation, and I started getting orders from people across the county. I processed enough wood that it became a legitimate side income, about $15,000 a year. I even hired a part-time helper during busy seasons. The irony wasn't lost on me that Brenda's attempt to shut down my farm equipment had actually led to me expanding the very agricultural activity she had opposed. If she had just left me alone from the beginning, I probably would have kept it small and personal. One Saturday in late April, I was processing a large order when Tom walked over with a couple of cold beers. We sat on my porch, watching the processor do its work in the distance. "You know," Tom said, "this whole thing changed the neighborhood for the better. People are actually talking to each other now instead of just avoiding each other to prevent HOA complaints. We had a block party last month, first one in 5 years. That's good to hear. And I've been thinking about getting some chickens." Frank said the HOA won't hassle me about it as long as I keep them properly. I raised my beer in a toast. To reasonable governance. To reasonable governance, Tom echoed. As summer arrived, life settled into a comfortable rhythm. I worked my engineering job during the week, processed firewood on weekends, and enjoyed my property without harassment. The new HOA board maintained respectful but friendly relations with residents. Meadowbrook Estates felt like an actual community rather than a place where neighbors spied on each other looking for violations. I still saw a few of Brenda's former allies around the neighborhood occasionally. Most avoided eye contact, probably embarrassed by their previous support of her crusade. A few had even apologized directly. The civil litigation finally concluded in July when the HOA's insurance company paid my attorney fees, and the sanctions ordered by Judge Morrison. The total came to just over $11,000, which more than covered my legal costs and compensated me for my time. Marcus called me when the check arrived. "Well, Patrick, I think we can officially close the file on this case. You won on every front. Thanks for all your help, Marcus. I couldn't have done this without you. You did the hard part by standing your ground and documenting everything. A lot of people would have just caved to the HOA pressure." After we hung up, I walked out to my equipment barn and looked at the firewood processor, the machine that had sparked such an absurd conflict. It sat there innocently, just a piece of farm equipment doing its job, completely unaware of the chaos it had caused. I thought about everything that had happened over the past year. The harassment, the legal battle, the vindication in court, Brenda's criminal conduct and arrest. It had been stressful and expensive and time-consuming. But it had also taught me important lessons about standing up for what's right, about the importance of knowing the law, and about how quickly things could spiral when people refused to be reasonable. The experience had also connected me more deeply to my community. The people who had supported me became genuine friends. The new HOA board included me in discussions about policy changes. I felt more invested in Meadowbrook Estates than I had before the conflict began. In September, the HOA held its annual meeting. Frank was elected president by a landslide, and the new board was full of reasonable people committed to common-sense governance. During the meeting, Frank publicly thanked me for forcing the organization to confront its problems. Patrick's willingness to stand up for his legal rights, even in the face of significant pressure, helped us realize how far off track we'd gotten, Frank told the assembled residents. "We're a better community now because of it." The room applauded. It was an unexpected and touching moment. As fall arrived and the leaves began to change, I found myself processing firewood for the coming winter. The work was meditative, the steady rhythm of the processor breaking down logs into neat stacks of split wood. I had customers lined up through November, enough to keep me busy every weekend. One crisp October evening, I was stacking wood when a car pulled up that I didn't recognize. A woman in her 30s got out, looking uncertain. "Are you Patrick Yardley?" "I am." "Can I help you?" "My name is Jennifer. I live in a development about 10 miles from here. I'm having a problem with my HOA about a greenhouse I want to build. Someone told me you might have advice." I smiled and invited her to sit on the porch. Over the next hour, I shared what I'd learned. Know the law, document everything, don't back down from a legitimate legal position, and find a good lawyer. I gave her Marcus's number. As she left, thanking me profusely, I realized this had become a kind of unexpected role. The guy who beat his HOA. The person other homeowners called when they needed advice on dealing with overreaching community associations. It was strange, but also satisfying. My experience, as difficult as it had been, was helping others navigate similar situations. That felt meaningful. By December, winter had arrived in full force. My house was warm, heated by the wood I'd processed from my own land with my own equipment. I looked out my window at the snow-covered fields, at the equipment barn in the distance, at the peaceful expanse of my 5 acres. This was exactly why I'd bought this property. Space, independence, the ability to live on my own terms while still being part of a community. The fight with the HOA had threatened all of that, but ultimately it had reinforced it. I pulled up the trail camera footage from my phone just to check things. Everything was quiet. No suspicious vehicles. No middle-aged women with clipboards. Just my property, peaceful and secure. The legal documents from the case sat in a file cabinet in my office. The court order declaring the HOA had no jurisdiction over my agricultural land. The judgment awarding me attorney fees. The restraining order that had stopped the harassment. I kept them all, not because I expected to need them again, but as a reminder of what I'd been through and overcome. As the year came to a close, I reflected on everything that had happened. 12 months ago, I had been a relatively anonymous homeowner just trying to make his property more efficient and useful. Then Brenda had appeared with her clipboard, and my life had turned into a legal battle that consumed months and thousands of dollars. But I'd won, not just in court, but in a deeper sense. I'd established my rights, helped reform a dysfunctional HOA, and built connections with neighbors that would last for years. I'd learned that standing up for principle, even when it was difficult and expensive, was worth it. The firewood processor sat in its usual spot near the equipment barn, silent now in the winter cold. In a few months, I'd fire it up again for spring orders. And this time, nobody would complain. Nobody would show up with citations or threats. I could operate my legitimate agricultural equipment on my agricultural land without harassment. That was all I'd wanted from the beginning. The right to use my property legally and in peace. It had taken a court order, thousands of dollars in legal fees, and the criminal prosecution of an out-of-control HOA president to secure that right. But it was secured now, permanently and clearly. I poured myself a drink and raised my glass to the window, looking out at my land. To property rights, to reasonable governance, to standing your ground when you know you're right, and to the quiet satisfaction of splitting firewood on a cold winter day on your own land, with properly licensed farm equipment that nobody can tell you to remove. The whole experience had been exhausting, frustrating, and at times infuriating. But standing here now, looking at my peaceful property on a cold December evening, I wouldn't change how I'd handled it. Sometimes you have to fight for what's right, even when the fight is difficult. Especially when the fight is difficult. Outside, snow continued to fall gently on Meadowbrook Estates. Lights glowed in windows up and down the street. Somewhere, families were gathering for dinner. The new HOA board was probably planning next year's community events. Life went on, quieter and more reasonable than it had been a year ago. And in my equipment barn, the firewood processor waited patiently for spring, ready to do the work it was designed for, legally and without controversy. Sometimes the simplest victories are the sweetest ones.